Okay, welcome back. Our second session on the Second World War. I'm going to try and make this one a little bit shorter than the first one. I think I said before that I'm still trying to get the hang of this online, this recorded sessions. And I just saw that the last one was like 55 minutes, which is sort of like, I wanted to make this more like 40, 45, because it's a lot to sort of, to have to sort of sit and listen to these, I know. So I'm going to try and do this a little bit quicker, and hopefully get you out in shorter time. And I think that's okay because resistance is it's we're going to talk about various groups of resistance, various kinds of resistance. But for our purposes, one of the most important ones, of course, are the communists. And I'll kind of use the second part of this lecture to talk about them and to talk about their way of resisting. But we will be coming back to them a lot next week and the week after and the week after that, and God help us the week after that, and right up until the end. Look, you must have expected there would be a lot of communism when you look, it has it in the title, for goodness sake. So you must have known that it was coming. So it's kind of okay. We'll talk about resistance, and I'll talk about where it came from and what it is. But we'll come to the communists today, but we'll keep coming back to them. So this is not the last time we'll talk about communist resistance during the Second World War. Okay, well, why don't we start by asking the same kind of question? If we move to slide number 2, let me just put the slide numbers up. This is still a work in progress. Yep, there they are. In slide number 2, what is resistance? Pose the same kind of questions as we posed of collaboration. What is collaboration? Well, as you can see in this slide, resistance is any kind of deliberate activity intended to undermine the occupation or the rule of the Axis forces. Now, with that simple sentence, that simple definition, of course, it can take many forms. There's political and military resistance, the most obvious kind, guerrilla or underground armies, this kind of thing. And I'll be showing you examples of those in this coming lecture. It could be terrorism, it could be spying, it could be sabotage. It could also be everyday acts of terror, everyday acts of undermining and sabotaging the regime. And so it doesn't have to be some sort of brave sort of guerrilla resistance or military action or derailing a train. It could be as simple as working a bit slowly, putting the wrong components in the propeller of a Messerschmitt so that it crashes whilst it's in the middle of a dogfight over Dover or something like this. There are various sizes and various scales of resistance. Now, of course, even these small ones, if they were discovered, would have grave consequences. And we're going to talk a little bit about the kinds of ways in which the Axis powers exacted reprisals to sort of try to dissuade people from carrying out acts of resistance. It can mean something like the death penalty for not fulfilling a work quota, or being found to have tried to sort of sabotage the working at a factory in Bohemia creating propellers for Messerschmitt planes or something like this. So reprisals could be very brutal, and they were, particularly at the beginning of the war, when Hitler simply wanted to show from the beginning that there would be absolutely no tolerance towards this kind of thing. Now, the vast majority of people, and this goes back also to what I was saying in this morning's lecture, in the previous session, the vast majority of people wanted to avoid trouble, as people usually do, at all levels, at all extents. They didn't want to get involved in resistance. They were not perhaps political people. They had families. They had lives. They just wanted to get on with things. So very many people didn't want to resist. By the same token, there were very many people who didn't want to collaborate either. They were forced to, or they tried to avoid these things. They didn't want to get involved in collaboration. Now, resistance in the first place was organized by the governments in exile, and we'll meet them in a moment. This was the initial kind of resistance, but ultimately those governments in exile lost their significance. They lost their standing, and they gave way in many cases to the communists, and the communists emerged as amongst the most important resistance forces towards the end of the war. Okay, so let's start with the government in exile. Now, in many cases, these governments. Just bear with me 1 second while I. Excuse me, the light was starting to shine on the screen and get in my way. Okay, well, the governments in exile were, in most cases, the governments of the interwar period. So the governments that we met very briefly in the 1920s and the 1930s, including in many cases the opposition as well. When the countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were defeated, those governments absconded, they got out of the country and they went into exile. Eventually, all of them ended up in London, although a lot of them did a lot of traveling during the Second World War. Now, London being a centre, of course, of anti-Axis resistance, not just for Eastern and Central Europe, but also for the French and the Belgians and this kind of thing, began to organise these governments, gave them temporary lodgings in embassies around and about in the capital, in the city, and assisted them in various ways, very often not as much as they had hoped to have been assisted. In coordinating exile, in coordinating resistance. Now, resistance was really an attempt, of course. It was an attempt to sort of undermine the occupiers, to loosen their grip on power, to sort of, to try to sort of beat the Nazis, to try to beat the Axis, to try to beat the Italians, to try to beat the occupying forces, and of course their domestic collaborators as well. But in many cases, it was also an attempt to show the Allies that they were out there, that they were active, that they deserved some sort of political recognition. Many of these governments in exile, they looked at somebody like Charles de Gaulle, who had, the government of Pétain in Vichy had already been recognized by the British, and Charles de Gaulle was not the official representative of the French state. He was just a sort of he was a different kind of figure, and many of the governments in exile were fearful that the same kind of thing would happen to them, that they would lose their state, that they would lose their international recognition. At the very least, they might lose these territories that Hitler had taken from them. So the government in exile of Czechoslovakia was very concerned that they would not get back Slovakia, that they would not get back the Sudetenlands. All of these were very sort of genuine and very very feasible fears, very deeply held fears, and resistance was a way of showing the world and showing the Allies that they were committed to the Allied cause, that they would help the Allied cause, that they were good partners. And of course, Churchill had set up the so-called Special Operations Executive, the SOE, which was a group that was whose task it was to create, to support resistance, to create resistance, to undermine Hitler's war, Hitler's empire. So Churchill was extremely happy that there were many Serbs and many Czechs and many Poles and many others who were willing to shed blood on behalf of the war that he was waging against Hitler. So he was quite pleased about that. Now, as things went on, the governments in exile lost their grip in most cases on the situation in their home countries. The war, as I said in the last session, was such an intense period and was such a transformative period such a transformative experience. It really did alter societies, altered people's mentalities, traumatized people, completely changed their outlooks. And in many cases, these government exiles were simply not involved in this transformation. They were away in London. Aside from the Blitz and this kind of thing, they were relatively comfortable. They were not sharing, in a sense, the suffering of their people, and they were less and less understanding what was happening in their country. Now, we'll talk about this in a couple of weeks' time when we talk about Yugoslavia and Tito. But one of the best examples of a government in exile that gets itself cut adrift is the Yugoslav government in exile. It left the country when Yugoslavia was invaded in 1941. It went into London. It was composed of various opposition and ruling groups. It made plans for the post-war period. It dreamt of what would happen in Yugoslavia after the Second World War. But all of the time they were doing this in London, Yugoslavia itself was engulfed in this massive guerrilla warfare. The Ustasha, various other resistance movements, collaborators, the communist partisans, whom we'll talk a lot about in the coming weeks. All of this was completely changing the country, and the government in exile were very far away from all of these changes, and they were not really, they were not actively involved in them, and they did not really well understand what was happening. Now, of course, ultimately, they were also outflanked by the Soviet Union, but we will talk about that in next week's session. Now, there were, in these government exiles, when the governments left, they did take with them remnants of their armies as well, those that had not surrendered, those that were still operational. And of course, as many of you will know, famously, parts of these Eastern and Central European armies served alongside the Allies, served alongside the British, served alongside the French. The most famous examples, of course, would be the Polish pilots and the Czech pilots, the Polish airmen and the Czech airmen who served at the Battle of Britain and served in the RAF to great honor. And to great effect in the Second World War. There's quite a nice movie that was made about, it must be 20 years ago now, in the late 90s, an epic Czech movie about these Czech pilots called Dark Blue World. It's quite a nice one. I put up a YouTube link to the trailer, which is in English. You can find this film, I think, on Netflix or elsewhere with English subtitles, and it's quite a nice, quite a touching tribute to the Czech airmen who fought alongside the British, the RAF, during the Second World War. Now, the very largest, if we turn to slide number 5. The very largest the very largest of the resistance movements was in Poland, the so-called Polish Home Army. As you can just about see from this map on the left-hand side of the slide, Poland was, during the Second World War, there was no official collaboration within Poland. It was not allowed. The Nazis did not want any. They simply divided the country up into smaller parts. They annexed the eastern parts to Germany, to the Reich. They created in the center a central government zone, which is, of course, ran by Hans Frank. They set up the death camps, they set up the concentration camps, and of course also because of the non-aggression agreement between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, the western parts, the eastern parts. I apologize. The eastern parts of Poland were annexed briefly by the USSR, by the Soviet Union. So Poland was completely dismembered, cut into various parts, and we'll talk more about that again next week when I introduce you to Czesław Miłosz, the poet, and I talk about his post-war work. There was no collaboration. The government and the army was defeated in very short order, but nevertheless, very quickly, a resistance movement, a sophisticated and very well organized underground resistance movement emerged in its place. This was the so-called Home Army. And the Home Army during the Second World War established within dismembered Poland essentially a state within a state. It wasn't just an army; it was also, a church. There were schools, flying universities. There was a system of taxation. This was a fully fledged underground state operating under the noses of Nazi rule. And the Polish Home Army was the largest non-communist resistance movement in occupied Europe during the Second World War. Now, the great epic of the Polish Home Army took place in 1944, the so-called Warsaw Uprising. And what the Warsaw Uprising involved, this happened late on in the war. The Home Army was still relatively well intact. But it could see that the Nazis were losing this war, but it was also very fearful that the Red Army would now advance into Poland and would occupy Warsaw and would be able to dictate terms to the Polish. So the Warsaw Uprising was the attempt by the Polish Home Army to capture the capital and in that sense to be able to negotiate on their own terms with the Allies, with the Red Army, with the Soviets. It was a very controversial move. It was one which was protested very loudly, very violently by the government in exile. They didn't want this to go ahead. They didn't want the Home Army, despite being connected with them, they didn't want the Home Army to carry out what they believed would be a very costly and indeed suicidal uprising. But nevertheless, the Home Army went ahead and did it. And indeed, it was a failure. It resulted in the complete destruction of Warsaw, which had to be entirely rebuilt by the communists at the end of the Second World War, and it was a disastrous failure. Now, it opens up a moral quandary, a moral question. Is it ever permissible? I mean, or is it permissible? Can we sort of, is it morally okay to take these kind of gambles, to take these kinds of risks, knowing that even if they do succeed, they will result in ferocious reprisals, ferocious killing, that this will be a devastating thing, whatever the cost. Is this a moral kind of, is this a moral imperative to resist in this way when the costs of doing such a thing are so high? The Warsaw Uprising, incidentally, is now almost like a cult item. A cult epic in contemporary Poland, especially in Warsaw. If any of you have ever been there, every district of Warsaw has its own stories about the Warsaw Uprising, its own graffiti, its own historiography, its own folklore. There's a huge museum in the center of Warsaw, which is this incredible multimedia experience of the Warsaw Uprising. There are countless action movies in which the brave Poles take on the beastly Nazis and this kind of thing. There's a huge cottage industry, or not even cottage, it's just a huge industry, multimedia, multi-million zloty industry dedicated to commemorating and to celebrating the Warsaw Uprising. So there is that. Okay, in slide number 7, let's move on to Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia, the government in exile, was headed by the successor of Tomáš Masaryk, a man called Edvard Beneš. Beneš had been with Masaryk in exile during the First World War. He had been the first foreign minister, of Czechoslovakia during the interwar period. And then when Masaryk left office in 1935, Beneš had acceded to the position of the presidency, and indeed he was the wartime exiled president during the Second World War. So Beneš was part of the government in exile, and Beneš was desperate to do various things, not least to sort of restore Czechoslovakia, but also Beneš very controversially and very energetically attempted to sell the idea to Churchill and also later on to Stalin that this German minority that lived within the borders of Czechoslovakia should be removed at the end of the Second World War. So there are very many millions of Germans, as you've seen, living in Czechoslovakia. They were used by Hitler as a Trojan horse to undermine Czechoslovakia. And Beneš was desperate that this could never happen again at the end of this conflict. And the only way to prevent this problem from reoccurring, from rising once again, was to simply remove in total the German population. And he sold this idea tirelessly to Churchill and to Stalin. Stalin was very keen on the idea. He had his own ideas about moving populations, Crimeans and this kind of thing within the Soviet Union. And indeed, at the end of the Second World War, as we'll find out, the German population was removed en masse. So that's Edvard Beneš. Now at home, he was aided by the head of government, a man called Alois Eliáš. And Eliáš was a double agent. He was ostensibly the head of the Czechoslovak collaborationist state, the prime minister, head of the collaborationist government, but in reality he was a double agent who had good contacts with London, who was undermining the state from within, and carried on doing so until he was discovered by the Nazis and he was arrested, and at least initially imprisoned for doing this. Now, as many of you may know, the great act of resistance within Czechoslovakia was Operation Anthropoid, which took place in May 1942. Now, Anthropoid was Edvard Beneš's idea, and Beneš was concerned with the apparent passivity and the apparent lack of resistance that was taking place in Czechoslovakia during the Second World War, and he compared it to what was happening in the Balkans. He compared it to what was happening in countries like Yugoslavia, where there was a very, as we'll see later on, a very lively and a very involved resistance movement, not just the communists but also non-communist movements, and he became very concerned about this. He was worried that this passivity, this lack of resistance within Czechoslovakia might undermine his diplomatic case in the eyes of the Allies, might undermine the case for Czechoslovak statehood, might undermine Beneš's calls for the Sudeten Germans to be removed from the country, so might have all kinds of negative consequences, and Beneš wanted to try to avoid these. So he cooked up a plan very carefully, which involved parachuting two young men into the Protectorate of Bohemian Moravia, a man called Jan Kubiš, a Czech, and a Slovak called Josef Gabček. And Kubiš and Gabček were to parachute into the country. They were to make contact with the resistance movement within the Protectorate, and they were to organize the assassination of the Nazi leader within the Protectorate of Bohemian Moravia, who was, of course, Reichsprotector Reinhard Heydrich. He's pictured in this picture. Now, many of you will know the story. It's been depicted countlessly in films and novels and all kinds of things. What happened and how the operation took place. Heydrich was relatively lenient towards the Czechs within the Protectorate of Bohemian Moravia, and he was relatively relaxed in the way he went about his daily routines. He drove around in an open-topped car. He wanted to be seen by the people. He was not taking a huge amount of security measures. So Gabček and Kubiš ambushed his car, opened fire as he was coming into Prague. It's an incredible story. The guns jammed. They wouldn't fire because it was so cold. or not a cold. I guess the guns were just unreliable. They got a shot off, but they kind of missed him. Heydrich stood up and started firing back, but they shot him, and they just wounded him. But the wound became infected by this fabric in his car, which got into the wound. Although it seemed initially that he had survived this attack, later on, about a week later, he died when his wound became infected and when his wound became poisoned. There was a film a few years ago with Cillian Murphy. I think he was playing Kubish. The film is called Anthropoid. It's very good, shot in Prague. The climax, which really did take place in a church in Prague called the Cyril and Metohia Church, Cyril and Methodius Church, was that's where they held out. They were given refuge by the Orthodox Church. The fire brigade, they found them. The fire brigade had to flood this church, and they eventually killed themselves rather than being captured by the Nazis. The film is very good. It's very grim. There's an even better film made in the 1960s, a black and white Czechoslovak film called Attentat, which is really, I think, the best version of this story. There's also a very good novel by a French novelist, whose name I've forgotten, but the novel is called HHHH. So it's a very romantic and a story which is very often told. The reprisals were horrible. On a serious note, when Heydrich was killed, Hitler demanded the most ferocious reprisals throughout Europe, but particularly, of course, in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Most infamously, they decided to attack and destroy the village of Lidice. That somebody had bragged in the city that they'd been involved in this operation, and they intercepted the letter in which he was bragging. This is a guy bragging to someone he wanted to sleep with. Could you believe? The Nazis intercepted this letter and decided to punish the entire village of Lidice, which meant wiping it off the map, sending every single man killing every single man in the village, and sending every single woman and girl in the village including children, of course, into concentration or death camps. So first of all, Theresienstadt, and eventually places like Treblinka and Auschwitz. That you can go and visit the city. It's about an hour outside of Prague, and there's a sort of quite a touching memorial, particularly to the children who were killed there. But it's difficult to sort of see this. It's a very upsetting. It's a very moving experience to sort of to see this and to think that that this is this act of mass murder happened. But there are others also as well. People were executed, including, for example, Eliash, who at the time was just imprisoned after the Heydrich assassination. He was taken out and shot as part of the reprisal movement. Now, it's again a very complicated one. Much of the resistance within the Protectorate was opposed to Anthropoid. This was really the brainchild of Edvard Beneš. And Beneš knew that there would be horrible reprisals, but nevertheless he believed that this was a risk worth taking, or rather that this was a price worth paying, because it would mean ensuring diplomatic recognition of Czechoslovakia, that it would strengthen his hand vis-a-vis the Allies and the Soviet Union, which indeed it did. Now, as historians, we're not lawyers, we're not judges, we're not the judges of the past. We can do that in our private time, we can do that behind closed doors, but in public we don't judge. Our job is to interpret the past, and our job is to explain the past. But nevertheless, and usually not to moralize about the past. We don't offer moral answers. We just try to explain how and why things happen, so people can understand better, how we ended up where we are, and why, and how things happen. But nevertheless, it does pose a very important moral quandary, a moral conundrum. Can such things be justified when they cause so much suffering and so much death? And when the instigators of such acts of resistance will know that these will cause so much suffering and so much death? On the other hand, would we be so quick to judge collaboration when in fact maybe people like Nedic, people like Hacker saved many hundreds, perhaps many thousands of lives by towing the line and by being very obedient towards the occupiers? I don't have answers to these questions, but they are ones that I ask student groups every year, and every time I teach this module, and it is indeed something worth thinking about. We might also think that statistically, very many of us, of course, would like to think that we would be amongst the resistors, and maybe we would, but statistically, most of us would not. Most of us would, of course, be amongst the collaborators. That was where the majority of people ended up. So resistance, whatever form it took, and whoever was involved in it. Resistance was really a double-edged sword. It could achieve its aims. It could certainly undermine the Nazis. It could undermine the Axis powers. It could weaken their hold on the states in question. It could strengthen the diplomatic hand amongst the Allies. It could have real military and political benefits, but at the same time, it also had horrible consequences. And the question is whether those consequences are worth paying. There were resistance groups who believed that it was indeed, almost like they invited the reprisals because they knew it would radicalize the population. In fact, the communist guerrilla groups, at least at the beginning of the war, were quite ready to, they would go into a village and shoot at SS officers, knowing that the reprisals would result in 100 people from the town being killed. For every one officer killed. This is originally the Nazi policy, the Strafen policy. They would happily do this, or they would at least willingly do this, knowing that such reprisals would radicalize people and would bring them into the fold of the insurgency. Very difficult calculations, one that mercifully we don't have to make, but ones that people did make during the Second World War in Eastern and Central Europe, and had to live in many cases with the consequences. Okay, finally, in the last few minutes, as I said, this one will be a shorter session. The communists. Now, we will be talking about these much more next week, so I'll just introduce them at this stage. The communists were accustomed to working in small cells. I'd mentioned that during the interwar period, the communists had been an underground movement. In all countries except Czechoslovakia, they had been illegal. And what this meant was they were very experienced and very adept at moving around undetected, and moving around without being able to act in small cells, having sort of plausible deniability, doing all the things you need to do when you're involved in clandestine political action. Now, they were, by this stage, completely under the control of Moscow. There's no two ways about it. Moscow was the only country which had had a successful, long-lasting communist revolution. In Moscow, an international group of communist parties had been formed, the Communist International, the Comintern, but in reality, Moscow was calling the shots. It's simply impossible that if the Bulgarian party or the Romanian party wants to sort of answer back to Moscow or Stalin, they're simply not allowed to do that. They're under the thrall of Moscow. Now, in the Balkans, and particularly in Yugoslavia and Albania, the communist resistance took the form of national liberation wars, guerrilla armies. We'll come to those in a minute. But the Communist Party was also relatively popular in Czechoslovakia for various reasons, having to do with the fact that the movement operated in the open during the interwar period, so it was able to sort of canvass. It ran in elections, ran pretty successfully, and was able to capitalize, as we'll see next week, on the disillusion with the Western liberal allies. France and Great Britain, caused by the Munich Agreement. The communist parties were much, much smaller in countries like Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. For various reasons, which we'll talk more and more about in the coming weeks. But the communist parties remained minority movements, largely urban, just a few thousand members. In no cases were they, of course, tainted by collaboration. The communist parties did not collaborate with the Axis powers, and as a result of that, they emerged from the war pretty clean. But again, this is something that we will talk about in the coming weeks. Okay, I want you just very briefly in slide number 10. We're going to talk about them in a couple of weeks' time, but I want you to meet them for the time being. The two most successful communist insurgencies during the Second World War. They took place in Yugoslavia and Albania. Mass national guerrilla forces, communist guerrilla uprisings, which fought not just the Axis, but also, in fact, more often, the local collaborators. In Yugoslavia, the communist movement was led by a man called Josip Broz, known by his communist nom de guerre or alias Tito. There he is in a cave, I think in Jajce in Bosnia, with his top leadership, his Politburo. At the bottom is the leader of the Albanian party, a man called Enver Hoxha, and he's sitting there with the Albanian partisans, also the leader of a very successful communist insurgency. In a couple of weeks' time, when we turn to the Balkans and we turn to the communist revolutions there, we'll meet them much more. But I just wanted to sort of introduce them for the time being and introduce them as military and political leaders of the most successful and the largest communist insurgencies in Central and Eastern Europe during the Second World War. Okay, thank you.